Good evening. This is Nanette Rainone. And tonight I have as my guests Andrea Dworkin, first of all, who lives in New York City on the Upper West Side, and who has written a book, which I like very much, called Woman Hating. It was published by Dutton in 1974. She has also written a couple of articles which have very compelling titles, so I'll read the titles of those. One is called Marx and Gandhi Were Liberals, Feminism and the Radical Left, and another called Why Norman Mailer Refuses to Be the Woman He Is. I never read that.
Neither did
Sounds good. And also, Carol Lopate is here. She is my very good friend and walked over to the East Side with me tonight and is going to be on the program with us. She is presently working on a book on the culture of housework. And we are here, though, to talk about Andrea's book, Woman Hating. I thought about how to talk about the book, and you have sections on fairy tales, pornography, foot binding, witch burning, and I think later we should go through a couple of them, at least in detail. But to get an overview and to get started, I thought it would be interesting to find out how you came to write it. You say something in the beginning of having started in Europe, in Amsterdam, I think, with somebody else. But what I'm really interested in is whether you were reading fairy tales, pornography, foot binding, witch burning. I mean, how you brought all those things together, where you started. Was it with the theory or with the individual items or one of those items? Or
It was with the individual items. I had been living in Amsterdam as a housewife, and I left my marriage, and I couldn't understand what had happened to me in the 3 years in which I had been married. And I was devastated, as many people are, when a marriage ends. And I thought there was an awful lot I must not know about life, about being a woman. I mean, I thought of myself as a talented, fairly self-confident woman who had a future as a writer and who had a good education, and I thought I knew what I was doing. I had many years behind me of leftist activism against the war and for civil rights, and I thought I knew myself and I knew what I was doing. And then things happened to me in my own life that were incomprehensible. I mean, a marriage that began in a friendship ended in a kind of absolute despair. And so a week after I left, I decided that I really wanted to find out what had happened to me. But I had this conviction that whatever it wasn't really so personal, because I saw what was happening to me happening to all of the women that I knew. And I also thought that in my life I had been living in a way that's commonly characterized as masochistic. But I did not accept what I had learned about masochism, psychoanalytically or historically. In other words, I did not think that it was personal. It seemed to me to be historical. Something that is consistently repeated by a gender class is not something that's personal. So I wanted to try to figure it out, and I made an outline of what I wanted to explore. And I began by thinking about and writing about the story of O, because that book had been very important to me. I had been very moved by it, very sexually stirred by it, but I also considered it this very profound work on the state of being a woman, which is extraordinary to me now, but I certainly did then.
profound in what sense?
Well, I thought that it really spoke to what love was about. Self-sacrifice, taking pain on oneself, total immersion in the man that one loves. It spoke to a set of values that I had internalized without even knowing it. I mean, I certainly didn't know that that's what I was acting out. And then at the end, I looked back and I said, wait a minute, that the behavior of that woman who was in that marriage isn't the behavior of somebody that I even know. And yet it was me, with my body. I was doing those things. Why? How did I learn to do them? Where did I learn that behavior? And so I made an outline. And I started with Story of O, and it developed in that way. I mean, I thought Story of O is the most compelling thing. The image was a book that interested me, so I wrote a chapter on that. I was living in Amsterdam at the time, which is where the sex magazine Suck was being published by people that I knew and I thought very highly of, and yet I despised the magazine. So I wanted to try to figure that out. And then it took me further. I mean, I thought about Chinese foot binding, and I said, wait a minute, there's something that's cultural. That's sadomasochism that's institutionalized. It's cultural and it's historical. I have to look at that. And the same with witchcraft.
You know, I'd read the book that you use as one of your sources on Chinese foot binding. Who wrote it?
Howard Levy.
Yeah. And I read about that, and I always forget it somehow. And I think that probably lots of people are not familiar with the dimensions of Chinese foot binding, what it really entailed, and how long it went on, and how many people were involved in it. Maybe if you talked about that and connected it back to the story of O, then the theme of your book would emerge, I think.
Okay, I'll try. It's sort of very hard for me because I feel, that I'm a writer, and that the way that I express what I know best is when I have the control of being in my room and writing about it. But Chinese foot binding was what we call the institution of crippling women at the age of 7 or 8 so that they could never walk again, or that their walking was severely impaired. A child's foot was taken and it was bandaged, and not the big toe, but the other 4 toes were bent under, and the big toe was left straight, but sometimes later it fell off. And the idea was to so constrict a woman's foot that when she was a grown adult woman, it would be no larger than 3 inches. And this had to be done without breaking the bones in her feet for aesthetic reasons. And of course, aesthetic reasons means that men should not be repulsed should they happen to see this foot. And, well, it happened for 1,000 years in China. There are still women living who had this done to them as children. They are crippled, even though their feet have been unbound.
Was it cross-class? Did it happen in all classes?
Yes. This is interesting. Most people who know anything about Chinese foot binding think that it only happened to upper-class women. Upper-class women were completely crippled. It was the mark of a man's masculinity and prestige that he could afford to keep a woman who couldn't shit for herself, right? She couldn't do anything. She couldn't walk. She couldn't move. She could only lay in bed and spread her legs open. And lower-class women also had their feet bound, but not so badly. I mean, they were allowed to walk, but their walking was impaired. They walked. The whole point always in patriarchal distribution of power is that a man, however powerless in relation to other men, is always more powerful than the woman who is his property. And so that women's feet were bound so that they could walk less well than the men that they lived with.
You talked about having a historical sense, and I think in going through your various chapters, we talked about foot binding in some detail, and then there's the story of the burning or execution of 9 million witches,
yes,
most of whom were women,
yeah,
I believe. And the question that leaps to mind is why? And some people have economic theories, and there are various theories of how the society benefits. But it seems that the extreme of binding feet and crippling and burning at the stake, and then you go through any number of fairy tales, right? Cinderella, Snow White, etc., where the woman is always in a totally passive, if not half-dead role,
yes,
and then saved. So that's the common culture, right, reinforcing this genocide. Why? What is it in the human circumstance besides money making? I mean, or maybe you think it is money making. I don't know that creates this situation.
Well, I mean, money making comes later. I mean, women were money. Women were the medium of exchange, the first medium of exchange, and the first owned objects in patriarchy, as far as we know. That question, it depends on how far back you go. I mean, we can look at the culture that we have, and we can say it happens because women are carnal and men hate that female carnality, and there certainly is an extraordinary body of evidence that indicates that for whatever reasons, female carnality is so horrifying to men
Well,
that
women
they
are carnal,
can't
men
bear
are
it.
carnal too, right?
Well, no. I mean, not culturally speaking. Culturally speaking, men are not carnal. Women are carnal. To go back to where that started, or when that started, or how it started, is so speculative that it doesn't seem useful to me. And one of the assumptions of the book is that by the time I was an adult, I had learned all of this stuff. I mean, it's happening now. I'm learning it now. I don't know how it started. I know theories, that's all. But we know what is, and that's what we have to do something about, because our lives are at stake. I mean, every day you know the brutality and the violence that women live under. And so that seems to me the priority, to understand what
I thought,
is
though, that
here
you
now.
offered a pretty compelling theory on when you talk about men sort of separating themselves out of nature, sort of the ecological criticism that you make.
But when you say why, you see, then you come to the question of why did they do that? I mean, how did that happen? There's no doubt that they've done it.
And that women have been made to represent the nature that they
Yeah, I'm just saying that I'm very bewildered by that first cause question. You know, I don't know the first cause of it.
I'm not sure. I mean, I sort of agree with you that it isn't the real question we have to obsess over. There's so much conflicting evidence and so much, and really, patriarchy under capitalism is a very specific kind of thing, and seems to me this is the history that we do have to focus on, because it's the context that we live in and where we have to work to change.
Yes, I'm not so committed to that particular formulation of it as patriarchy under capitalism, because I think that these sex roles, are also manifest in socialist countries. To me, it's not a question of sexism being a function of economics. It's very much the other way around, with sexism being the constant and racism. And I think that as we begin to go back in time, what will turn out to be finally one of the most important and interesting questions is, what is the relationship between sexism and racism? How do those two live together? I think that the origins have to do with sexism. But how did racism develop out of that? What is it? How does racism tie into male identity? What are the sexual roots of what racism is about? And I have a feeling that as feminist theory advances and as women struggle, there are going to be some answers there that are really going to, for the first time in history, really make an impact on the racist structure of this society that we live in.
Maybe I asked my question wrong when I said why, but what I found the part of the book, although I've heard the theory before somewhat. Well, you've heard a lot of the theory of the separation of mind and body, and I think that you're saying that when men took control of nature, that is, took agriculture, and what we have now is almost a total separation and a destruction of the environment, in fact. And those two issues coming together at the same time, that is, the women's movement and the ecology movement at the same time, is interesting. And that's what I meant to talk about. I didn't mean to ask why people didn't stay in touch with nature.
Yeah.
I guess there are other people thinking about that.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, because after all, we're faced with the destruction of the planet. And women have been both the producers and the guardians of life. And this triviality that we're accused of, and we're told that we live these trivial lives, and our lives are involved with doing the work of life itself, of building homes and having children. And I mean, I think that will not continue to be our work, because after all, what we want is a human community in which everyone is connected to life in that way. But certainly, I really feel that the very future of the planet has to do with feminism. I mean, these.
Do you really, though? I mean, do you think that
really
that the two things come together, that women, as a result of the experience that they've had in the past, both as of oppression and as caring for life, sustaining life, do have a particular vision in that area? Or?
Well, I think we've got a chance at it. I think that men are so immersed in their death culture that they don't know anything about life anymore. And, you may find the one who does. I may know the one who does, but that doesn't matter. I mean, I think that characteristically, men are the agents of a death culture. And that there's a chance. We have a chance. And the other thing that I think is that the causes of most of the institutions that are oppressive to women and to other people are very rooted in sexual identity. I mean, this is really where my work is. That's what I believe. So that I see war very much as a function of phallic identity. And if that's so, and if we can learn to understand that, and if we can change the communities in which boys are raised and the ideas of manhood that they internalize, then possibly we can eliminate war as a historical fact. I mean, I think that we're very close. I think that feminists are very close to understanding the causes of war and violence and killing in ways that have never been understood before. And therefore, I think that that's another reason that feminism is so hopeful and so connected to life in that way.
I'm not clear what specifically you're referring to, whether you see this in the broadest aspects of the women's movement, whether you see it in particular theorists, whether you see it in evidence in women everywhere, whether they are identified as feminists or not. See, I'm not clear. I mean, I know that there is some body of evidence, that is some theoretical work that's being done which says that that is so, and projects a role for women to stand against the death culture.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I'm not so sure that there's an evidence in the women's movement as a whole, nor that there is evidence coming if you look at the lives of women who don't identify that way. In other words, the broadest group of women you can imagine.
I certainly understand what you're saying. I mean, I have a very hard time doing sort of analyses of the women's movement, what it is and what it's doing and where it's at. I feel that I'm a woman whose life has been very much changed by what I would identify as the women's movement.
I think all three of us feel that way.
Yeah, sure.
But
now we are members of the women's movement. I mean, we are ourselves participating in things that will change other lives. And I think that one of the most interesting ways of looking at this is right, I hope I can make all these connections. In my view, men are not biologically the way they appear to be, okay? They're not biologically aggressive, destructive, and horrifying in many manifestations. This is learned behavior. Now, if that's so, it's clear that women can also learn that behavior, all right? And that may happen. We may lose. The movement may be co-opted. Women may sell out. Greed, buying and selling, all of that stuff is going to touch us, and some of us are going to be really laid low by it, but some of us are not. And our struggle, the struggle of those of us who are not, is to change what we see around us. I find in American radicalism and feminism, which comes from that radicalism, a tremendous kind of naivete about if it can't be done now, it can't be done. But it's not really that question, is it? Because the question is, do we lay down and die? Do we participate in this violence all around us that we hate? Or do we, no matter what our chances of success are, try to live a different way and try to do a different kind of work? And I don't know what the final outcome will be, but I know that I don't want to lay down and die, and I know great numbers of women who don't want to lay down and die. And I don't have some, prophetic statement about the women's movement. I'm very distressed by a lot that I see happening in the women's movement. But in another way...
Do you want to say some particular things that distressed you?
Well, no.
It's always hard.
I sort of want to ask you something, which is, I guess I come from a different place than you do, and I'd really like to articulate more sort of the differences between us, because I find your argument really compelling, but I don't buy it completely, which is the kind of the primacy of patriarchy in explaining everything, right? from my reading of anthropology and history and so on, until now, really the evidence points to all cultures having been somewhat patriarchal. I mean, the matriarchal cultures that we, longed for at the beginning of the women's movement really seem more myth than actuality. And if one uses patriarchy then to explain, it seems to me one doesn't get very far in explaining why sometimes one has a war and other times one doesn't. Or if this is something which has also existed until now and we use that as a kind of ultimate analytical tool, how do we explain transcending it now?
Mm-hmm. Okay. One can take a particular war and say it happened because of this, that, and the other, okay? Oil or cotton or a border dispute or whatever. But what one has is the constant of war. I mean, that's what remains constant. The other thing that remains constant is the sexual polarization of men and women and the kinds of behaviors that are derived, the values that are derived from that polarization.
Well, where does this constancy lie? I mean, are you at some level giving a structural analysis? Are you saying that this is embedded in culture per se?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
If that is so, yeah. Right. It's a kind of structural,
Yes.
position. I mean, Levi-Strauss would say it too, except
Yes.
he would come out for it.
That's right. That's right, and I'm coming out against it.
Right. But he would say that because it's the structure of culture, we can't change it. In fact, it will continue on and on.
Right, and I'm saying we can change it and we must change
How
it.
does one change something? I mean, by sort of definitionally, something which is a structure isn't changeable, or certainly not changeable dramatically.
It's not changeable easily. That's the core of it. It's not changeable. You don't just say, I want it to be changed, or, would you please change, or something like that. It's not changeable easily, but any structure can be changed by being reformed or by being knocked down, and you build another one, and structures can be changed that way. You've brought up two questions, and they touch on each other. One, you mentioned matriarchy as a possible predecessor to patriarchy. I've never been,
I mentioned it as a myth of a possible predecessor.
Right. Well, you see, I think that myth is important in this way, in that I think that it's so important to women because women long for some memory of a past in which they were not enslaved.
But I think that memory probably is inaccurate, and therefore I would rather that we go ahead.
Well, I agree with you, but I think it's very important to understand that it's very hard for any group of people to move ahead when they have nothing in their past that gives them pride. And what matriarchy does for women is that it gives us as a gender class a kind of pride. It gives us a memory of being powerful instead of powerless. For instance, you can see how this functions if you think about Algeria. Algeria under the French, but the Algerians had a memory of when the French were not there. And it's
but that was an accurate memory.
Yes, it was. I'm saying that I don't know whether the matriarchies are fictive or not, but they are mythic. They are mythic in that way that myths used to energize people to live the kind of lives that they want to lead.
I think that if we can use them as myths and be energized by them as myths, then that's really good and right, and I also believe sort of that anything that people can conceive of can be.
Yes.
But
see, there's another problem with this thing of matriarchy, and this is Barbara Deming's idea. I'm just repeating it, which is that one of the explanations that she thinks might be possible for the rise of patriarchy is that the matriarchies were unjust. In the matriarchies, men were inferior. And there's a lot of evidence, whatever the myth is, the myth includes those acts of injustice toward men, and that therefore there was a rebellion because people don't tolerate injustice for more than however many thousands of years they do. And
we've tolerated it for quite a while.
That's right. And they may have too, you know. But what they did, presuming that there was this rebellion because men were treated unjustly, is that they just created a mirror society. That's what we don't want to do. I mean, that's what our struggle is about. To me, what compels me, the vision in the women's movement that compels me, is not the matriarchal vision, because I am not very compelled by the idea of female supremacy, which is a popular idea in the women's movement. I'm very compelled by the idea of a genderless society, that is genderless in that gender as we now know it won't exist. That to me is compelling, and that's what I choose to work for. But I think that the idea of a matriarchy is instructive if what we learn from it is, one, that we have that memory of pride, and two, that we understand that it was unjust and that we don't want to repeat the same mistakes. We're not out to create a society in which women can do to men what men have done to women. Now that puts an incredible burden on us. Because
that's where you get back to sadomasochism again, because what we don't want to reproduce is dominance and submission at any level.
But going back to your question, Carol, about sort of why, to me, the notion that we live under patriarchy is the compelling bit of political information, is that as I see it, that's the only way of analyzing and understanding things to the level where we're not just going to repeat patterns. In other words, where we don't just have what Robin Morgan has called another coup d'etat among men, okay? Where we can really try to figure out and to eliminate the patterns that we've internalized that make pigs of us all, pigs and victims, right? And that's what feminism is about. And that's why it's revolutionary, and that's why, in my view, anything short of it is very reformist. It will make things better here or there for a certain group of people, but it's not going to entirely transform that structure that I believe has to be transformed. I don't think that there's freedom within that structure, is what I'm saying.
You know, you're talking about internalizing the structure, and it seems to me that what that brings up is something that I feel really deeply, which is that feminism has to have a psychology. We really have to understand how people become how they are, and we have to understand how it is that we can make people become other than the way they are now.
I think so too, but I feel a kind of difficulty even with using the word psychology because of what it means in this culture. I mean, I think that psychology that isn't political is terribly destructive. The notion that you have a personal life that isn't part of the community life, the notion that even the family isn't just the individual representation of the culture, is to me a very faulty one. And it also, I think, what psychology as we now know it does is really to keep people from taking responsibility to lives outside of their own, to really see that commonality of circumstance. You disagree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true of almost. I mean, I'm thinking of all the kinds of words that you're challenging, and we have an English language, and I sort of agree that it's embedded in every word is all these kinds of problems of the isolation of the individual, problems of domination, so on and so on, and yet we have to work with these words and.
Well, I mean,
we also have to work with the history of what's happened. When I say we need a feminine psychology, I mean we need a feminist psychology. We need to understand how people grow up, and if there are non-authoritarian ways in which people can grow up and relate to each other. Because if they don't grow up, I believe, in non-authoritarian ways, they won't relate as adults.
Right.
That way.
Yeah.
And whatever word you're going to call that, I think that's, a very prime task of feminism.
I agree with that. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that we have this incredible task, which I don't think anyone has ever had before, and it does involve remaking the language. We have this terrible problem, which is that we have to use the language that patriarchy has given us. And that language doesn't make room for our experience in our lives. And I mean, as women writers, we confront that all the time. What are we going to call it?
When you were talking about matriarchy, I wanted to, and you said at the end what I thought from what I had read in your book, that you reject that model. And then you gave in the book you had a section on androgynous myths of androgyny.
Yeah.
What status do they have in to reality? In other words, do they represent a culture for you, or are they simply myths that were never related to a culture?
To me, they're myths that indicate possibilities, and
maybe you could give a couple because they're so poetic and nice. I don't, which maybe makes me say that I think they're myths. I don't know when I say they're
sure.
poetic.
Well, I mean, the obvious one, of course, is that let's use the Judaic tradition because that's the first one in our culture. There's a story in the Zohar, it's a Kabbalistic story, that Eve was not the first woman who was created. Lilith was. And, the Hebrew in this is very interesting because the Hebrew word for God, Elohim, is a plural word, which has both, I think it has a male root, it has a female root and a masculine ending. And this Kabbalistic notion is that the first being created was called Adam Kadmon, and that being contained Adam and Lilith. And Lilith was the female, could be isolated as the female. And this was the first created being, and God, in his infinite wisdom, chose to separate them because he wanted Lilith married formally to Adam. And Lilith would hear nothing of it.
Sounds like the introduction of law.
Yeah, that's right. And she rebelled. And she split. She left for the netherworld or wherever. And since that time, Lilith has been considered a witch in Jewish tradition, the witch who comes in and kills the children of good women. And, that's clearly a patriarchal construction on an original myth of male and female being in one body. And all cultures in the world, tribes, whatever, have these original myths. What happened is that very often these beings were characterized as feminine because the presumption was that the feminine function of reproduction was the most important one, and therefore the noun was a feminine noun. But throughout human history, if you look, there are these myths that indicate that we are not these discrete, separate polar beings who have entirely different natures from each other, but that in fact there's a commonality of what we call male and female. Those words are so corrupt that who can bear to use them? I have a lot of trouble with them because we're not talking about a little male in a person and a little female in a person. We're talking about a being who is neither male or female as we understand the words. Anyway, these myths are pervasive. You can find them everywhere. And my notion is that since we have a choice, let's live from those myths and not from the ones that we use. Let's use Adam and Lilith. Let's not use Adam and Eve, because the Adam and Eve myth is degrading to women. It says terrible things about our character that people are taught from the day that they're born. So let's not use it. And to me, what those androgyny myths do is that they, to my imagination, give me possibilities that I wasn't taught in this culture. And yet, clearly, people imagined them.
Where I was leading with all of this, I think, is up to the moment, is that I know about myself. It's very deeply rooted in me that when I meet a person, the first thing I have to check off before anything else is this person male or female. Now, I'm not sure what follows from that, and sometimes I suspect that much more than I'm willing to admit or have learned or am willing to deal with does follow from it. But, and that has, and it often is very obvious, sometimes just for dress, but there are other characteristics that make it obvious. Some of them gestures, but some of them just body features, breasts as opposed to no breasts or whatever. Although that's not a constant, really.
Yeah, that could lead you to pretty wrong routes.
But when you talk about the vision that the androgyny myths give you, and what do you picture? Do you picture a time in which that wouldn't be so important? It would take, that the male-female split. How would it feel? That's.
Well, see, there are two things here that can easily be confused. One is that under patriarchy, it will always be important because men will have access to power that women don't have. And in that sense, when you meet someone, it's very wise of you to determine whether they're male or female, because if that person is male, that person is likely to be acting very much against your interests in his life. So that's one thing. That's a political necessity of living in the world that we live in. But I think that given that male and female, those categories describe very little about people. I mean, they describe very little about people's sexual potentialities, their erotic constitution.
Yeah.
And we know so little because at best, I mean, say that we have a kind of incredible visionary view of what could be. We only have it from standing where we are.
In the political picture as it exists now, or the world picture as it exists, with an economic crisis sort of in the foreground, it seems that the question of a women's movement as a separate phenomenon, or whether men and women should work together, is like a very pertinent question.
Mm-hmm.
And whether the kinds of things, since the ideal is androgyny, and since the questions of social change are very complicated, I think it would be useful for us to explore the ways that women would work and what they would work around, you know. And I am convinced, I think as you are, that the patriarchy question is a basic, if not the basic structure that has to be dealt with. On the other hand, it's hard for me to step aside from wanting to deal directly with the questions, with economic questions, with socialism, with, you know, and to be in there struggling around those things at the same time.
But see, I think you can be in there struggling, but do the struggling with women who have a commitment to the freedom and welfare of women. I mean, I think that it's very destructive to struggle with men who will spit on you when you've done for them what you can do. And that is the common experience of women in the left. And some women stay there and they continue to have that experience, and some women don't. I mean, if I want to make a protest action against the Vietnam War, I do it with my feminist sisters who also care about those things, but who also care about the struggle of women.
Are you saying that you wouldn't work in groups with men directly?
Well, I'll tell you, I don't. And it's not that I don't because I made a promise to myself, or that I have an idea that I am that's not connected with life. I mean, like many feminists, I come out of the left. I spent 8 or 10 years struggling with men in different actions for different purposes. And there's an incredible amount of bitterness that I have and that other feminists have, that these men have not changed and do not seem willing to change in terms of their own sexism and their own domination of women. And no, I will not do anything for them anymore. No, they cannot count on my body being in that demonstration. No, I will not make them a cup of coffee. No, I will not write the leaflet that they will then sign.
Well, there are other ways of relating in those groups.
I don't think that, I think it was true when women moved out of the left in the 60s that they were making coffee and writing leaflets. I think the question is at another level.
Not in my experience. I mean, I've been, invited to meetings of the People's Party, to the women's caucuses, and know a little bit about 7 days and various other things. I don't think it's changed. I think it's stayed very much the same. And I think that it's, for me, it's impossible. This has happened to me recently. I am constantly changing my mind about this and going one more time to try. And I've walked out of a great many meetings because when the boys stop talking about what the problem is and they start discussing Marilyn Chambers, I don't want to be there. And so I get up and I leave. And I do not want to place my body and my work on the line for people who are really my enemies until they change. And I hope that they will.
I don't see the Marilyn Chambers example harks back to me to the getting cups of coffee. I think the problem is enormously complex. I think that when you enter a struggle in which women obviously do not have an edge, they have an unedge, that you're in a problematic situation, but that there still is a dialectic to the struggle, that is women when you struggle with men. In other words, you're in an ongoing way engaging the question that we are talking about, the problem of patriarchy.
And I disagree. I think that, first of all, I'm willing to struggle with men as comrades when they understand what I feel is crucial, which is that women's struggle is the basis, that the oppression of women is the basis for the other kinds of oppressions about which we're all committed to ending. I am not willing to struggle with people who do think that it's a separate issue that has to be laid aside until after the revolution. And I want to say that there's an awful lot of historical proof that there is no revolution when that issue is laid aside. I mean, it's absolutely at the center.
I think
I agree.
Also that Sheila Rowbotham's book on women, resistance, and revolution really shows that every time that the women's struggle hasn't been kept up, that they, when the revolution was over, they were really put way back, where they came from. But it seems to me that you're posing two extremes. On the one hand, that women's struggle be prime, and on the other hand, that's left until afterwards, in which case we know it doesn't take place at all.
Well, you see, in my view, there are many reformist ways of relating to women's struggle. They are not, for me, compelling. I'm not interested in them. And I don't feel that it's useful for me to try to change the minds of men. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in changing the minds and hearts and bodies and souls of women. Mm-hmm. And in my view, it's like, you could take a work strike as your model. When women refuse to support men in the way that they have, the men will change too. They will die or they will change, one or the other, and that's up to them. I don't feel that it's useful to struggle with men, the example that you gave, in a Marxist debate. Mm-hmm. It's just not useful. Because you are replicating a situation in which you are acknowledging, you're interacting with those men in a way in which they can continue their domination over your life. You have to accept their language or you have to leave. I'm really saying that I don't think that women should ever struggle in a situation where they're being told to forget who they are. Mm-hmm. Not ever.
But then, that I agree. But I agree with what you're saying. But how do they bring that question into the forefront? I've read things like the Red Umbrella Manifesto, and I saw the women's question relegated to a section or a paragraph. And I thought that would have been a much better document if, in fact, the feminist analysis had permeated it. And it seems like that's something that women are going to do, I see that there's an economic crisis in the country. And I think it's important for us to relate to that. Now, women are in a double bind, right? Because we're so poor and because the first people who are going to be laid off, out of work, are going to be women. Mm-hmm. So that fighting for more jobs and against job discrimination, which might have been a wrong tactic, and I think to some extent was, right from the start, just isn't something that's going to work under these market conditions. Okay, so then the question is, how do we begin to address that?
Okay, this is crucial. Because, as you've pointed out, women are going to be devastated by what's happening now in this country, economically. Because women are going to be devastated, and it's not just by losing jobs. I think there's going to be new abortion legislation. I think this society is going to be invested in making women childbearers again. Right, so we're going to be touched on every level by this, because the only way to get those women out of the marketplace is to make sure that they get pregnant, and that's going to happen. So how can you struggle with people who will be glad when you're invisible again? If we understand that that's going to devastate women, how can we struggle with people who are almost going to be relieved that women are becoming invisible? And I think that the left, for the most part, will be relieved. Very glad that women aren't there to bother them. There hasn't been any commitment on the part of the left to even to the simplest kinds of accessibility of work to women. There is still the presumption that it's more important for a man to have a job. There isn't any understanding about women who are the heads of families or women on welfare. There's very little of it. So to me, this would be an opportunity where leftists could become very active with women's struggle at the center. I mean, really very high in consciousness, but that's not happening. And so I don't have a very optimistic view of whatever the left does is benefiting women. I don't think it will. I think they'll be very glad when they can't find us anymore.
But that doesn't address the economic question. Do you picture the situation that women in their own groups will be fighting again the abortion laws?
Women are going to be fighting for survival in a way that we almost can't imagine. I mean, you both know what it's like for women to try to survive economically in this society.
We're both underemployed.
Yes, yes, and it's so on the first thing is that women's existences, which are already marginal, will be so tentative as to be unimaginable, even by us now. The second thing is that I believe that there's going to be a change in the abortion laws, and that there's going to be a lot of that kind of emergency talk that people always do. I mean, it happened in Russia after the revolution.
But Andrea, you're saying what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
We should talk about what we're going to do. I mean, it seems to me the way you're describing it puts us right away in a very, very defensive position.
Well, see, I think that we are, because they have the power.
Yeah, but there's offensive and there's defensive strategy, and there's offensive and defensive ways of
Okay,
talking
so that's
about it.
another question. I mean, the question...
I thought that's in a way what you were saying. Sort of
Yeah,
like, as feminists, what do? We've got a real economic crunch. We all understand that. We live with it daily, right?
Yeah.
We know that women friends that we have are going to be afraid of leaving their husbands because they won't be able to find jobs. They're very specific configurations. There's the abortion thing and so on. Where is our struggle?
Well, that's where our struggle is, right? I mean, it's like if you were to say to me, what should we do? I could reel off, well, we should have houses where women can go. We should develop self-supporting industries. We have to find communal ways of taking care of children. We have to make sure that women don't have to stay with their children as indentured servants because they'll starve if they leave the house. But those are all things that we had to do a year ago, too. I mean, those are all things that we've been trying to do, and that our success has been minuscule precisely because of the odds that we face, and those are the same things that we have to continue trying to do. What do we do when they change the abortion laws? I mean, what do we do? Women are going to start dying again on the tables of quack abortionists. In that instance, I think it's very clear that we can't let them change those laws. But we've already lost a struggle here in New York State. I mean, they have already made conditions that make abortion very difficult for poor women to get. So, it's very hard for me to speak out of an optimism that I don't feel. I mean, I really see women being
but we all have,
devastated.
particularly given that we're unemployed, even though we all have our own
Gigs.
let's say writing commitments or whatever, we all do have evenings a week that we have free, and we have days in which we can work, and we choose to spend them doing certain kinds of political activity. That's sort of how I was thinking of the question. And I think one of the things that's really attractive to me is the idea of a place where women can go.
I think it's very important.
Yeah.
I mean, what does a woman do who's been beaten by her husband?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, where does she go? Well, she has to go home sometime. There's no place else she can go.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed. Now, the thing is that this talk makes it sound, I mean, again, the work that women have done is becoming invisible. I mean, the work that women in this city have done on rape is astounding. There have been real changes that touch women's life, women who are raped. Rape continues. We haven't stopped rape. Rape gets worse. But when women are raped, the treatment that they get is better than it was, and that's a result of the work that women have done. And I think that there are two things that we have to keep doing. One is that we have to keep increasing our ranks, and people don't usually understand what that means. I mean, when a woman comes to the point where she's struggling as a feminist, really her whole personality has changed, her whole life, her whole sense of herself. So it's not just a question of joining an organization. It's a question of changing the very psychology that you were talking of women.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that we have to do, I think, is be very action-oriented, very specific. Abortion, rape. I think my own belief is that women have to start organizing in much the way that the early Vietnam demonstrations were organized before you needed 200,000 people in all the major networks. Groups of 10 women, groups of 15 women, groups of 20 women have to find out where something's happening that's damaging to their lives, and then they have to take action on it. And that has to start happening all across the country. It doesn't matter if the New York Times is there to cover it. You know, we have to be there, and we have to be confronting the people who are hurting us. And that's what I see in the immediate future. I mean, that's the kind of activism that I envision happening now, as, you know.
One of the things that concerns me, and this is again to go back to the psychological thing, excuse the expression.
No, we've made clear what we mean.
Is that in times of economic scarcity, people feel fear, and women particularly feel fear. And times when one feels fearful are not great times for making changes, expansive changes, so that it seems to me that this is really going to be a hard time for feminism to grow. In the process of, you know, doing work on housework, I've talked to lots of women who are housewives, you know, and there is a lot of fear, and the fear isn't based on myth, it's based on some very real realities.
Yes. See, one of the terrible things is, or one of the most difficult things is, that women don't make these changes in their lives for the reason, I mean, you've said it, these fears that women have are not based on myth. It's very hard for a woman to survive without a man. And it hasn't changed. I mean, we don't have a safe place into which a woman can move. And I went through that. I went through it in Amsterdam, where I also couldn't get work. Maybe I could have here, but I couldn't there because of the language and residency and all that kind of stuff. So I feel very connected to that struggle. And mostly what I feel about it is that there is not an easy way. And I don't think that women make the kinds of changes that we're talking about unless they develop the capacity, and to me this is very interesting, to feel what they're really feeling. Most women live their lives so alienated from their own lives that they don't know what they're feeling. I mean, a man hits them and they don't feel what's happened to them.
Yeah. It's very interesting, particularly given the myths about women being so in touch with their feelings in contrast to men, for whom the myth goes, you know, they're not in touch.
Yeah. See, to me, it's like a slaughter. It's like there's going to be a slaughter in this country, and the slaughter is going to be a slaughter of women. I mean, whether their bodies live or die. And one could almost say, and I've heard it said, and I myself tend to believe it, that a lot of this is happening, I mean, being engineered by those who engineer our economy and our culture because of the women's movement, because of the change in women. I mean, it's been very poorly delineated, and I can't entirely delineate it now, but I don't think that there's any way of measuring how threatened and how anguished men are by that specter of woman's power. And I think that one can make a very good argument that a lot that's happening on the, you know, the visible political sphere that doesn't appear to be related at all to the women's movement has to do with a reaction against women emerging from their homes and women emerging sexually. I mean, I don't think that that specter of female carnality is any less threatening now than it was when the witches were burned.
Yeah, I don't either, which is why I think that you have to explain the tremendous growth of monopoly power now in a specific way, in a way which isn't just to do with the fear of women, because there's been rapid growth of the large multinational supranationals, and the middle industries are being cut, and the little business men are getting it very, very badly, you know. And so to talk about women's carnality as having really done it, or having been a motivation, it seems to me that
a motivation is what I'm saying. I mean, I think that there's no way of measuring the institutional reactions to the emergence of women, because we too little understand how that male psyche regards us to begin with. I mean, it's very hard for us. How can we understand that we're seen as the creatures that we're seen as? How can any woman begin to understand that she's really regarded that way? But I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think that those things have very specific causes, but to me, the broader issue that I'm interested in is how that drive for male power relates to masculine sexual identity, to the sex act itself, to the way that boys are raised, to the way that they derive their sense of masculinity over and against what's called the femininity or the powerlessness of women. To me, that is the broad issue. That's the constant in all of the things that you're talking about. And I can't presume to explain it all, but to me, that's the area of inquiry that's going to give us the richest results and going to show us the way to change